Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another special episode of Spectrum. This is Zaki Khalid. I am joined by Mr. Ahmed Quraishi. It's a privilege to have him on this program. Mr. Quraishi is a journalist, author, and television personality with extensive experience in Pakistan, the Middle East, and North Africa. He is a public diplomacy expert and maintains a quick turnout capability on situational insights regarding Pakistan, West Asia, the Middle East, and the region at large. Sir, thank you very much for joining me in this program.
My pleasure, Zaki, to be with you.
Sir, my first question for you is going to be very generic and broad, so you may take as much time as you want. Do you consider the ongoing conflict, this sudden conundrum that has emerged between Israel and Palestine, nothing new, obviously, but do you consider this particular instance to be a long overdue manifestation, or has it taken the region by total surprise? What are your views on this?
To be very frank, Khalid, I think that this has taken a lot of people by surprise. I mean, obviously, this is a conflict that's been going on for a long time. Everybody knows that. But I think this is specific escalation that happened right now. I think it's taken a lot of people by surprise, and especially the Israeli military. And I think that this was unexpected. Things were going in a very different direction. I think the whole focus was on the evictions, and the whole focus was on some of the Jewish extremist groups that were or suddenly became active in Jerusalem and came out and probably sought a confrontation with Palestinians and with Israeli Palestinians, and that was the whole focus. And of course, you had the eviction thing that's happening in Sheikh Jarrah, the suburb. So I think everybody was caught by surprise. Everybody was focused, and of course, you had this whole report by the Human Rights Watch, which was on Israel being an apartheid state and so forth. And the whole focus was on human rights and Palestinian rights. And all of a sudden, you have a militant group, Hamas, barging in, and I would say it hijacked the whole narrative and turned it to somewhere else.
That's a very interesting response from you because speaking of Hamas, now the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, it has used the usual pretext of Hamas-sponsored terrorism as justification for its air raids in Gaza. But on the other end, if we, for the sake of, if we subtract the Palestinian narrative, there are many scholars of the Middle East who are based in the West as well, who are starting to believe that there had been a long effort by the Israeli political opposition to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to get him out of power. And he has been desperately trying to secure seats and continue for another term, including support from his spy chief. So basically, to sum it up, some people believe that this is a wonderful opportunity for Netanyahu to score some political brownie points and perhaps make a last ditch effort for face saving. How do you analyze these conflicting claims?
No, I fully agree with that. I mean, this is a golden opportunity for Prime Minister Netanyahu. There's no doubt about this. I think this has been offered to him on a golden plate, and who offered it? Actually, it's really Hamas. I mean, there's no doubt that some of his base was trying to sort of, as I said, there were some Jewish extremist groups that were condemned both inside Israel and outside Israel, and these extremist groups aligned themselves with Prime Minister Netanyahu's base, and they sought a confrontation. There's no question about it. But to give Prime Minister Netanyahu this opportunity to play his strong hand was done solely by Hamas. I mean, there's no way around this. I would even go as far as saying that I think the Israeli government and the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu was on a back foot when it came to what happened in Jerusalem. The riots that happened that were started by right-wing, ultra-nationalist Jewish groups. It put the prime minister on a back foot, and with the HRW report, and with the evictions issue in Sheikh Jarrah, the suburb of Jerusalem. I think these three things had put the prime minister on a back foot, and I think here comes Hamas and shift the whole narrative to something else, raining all these rockets from Gaza to inside Israel, and shift the whole narrative and gives the Prime Minister Netanyahu, the opportunity to do whatever you described. So for me, it's very hard to just walk around the elephant in the room, and that is Hamas. And it's interesting that not many people really talk about what could be the objectives of Hamas, because on the face of it, of course, they say they're doing it for Palestinian rights. I'm not sure if stealing the narrative away and focus away from the evictions of Sheikh Jarrah and the whole focus on what happened in Jerusalem and the evictions and taking it to Hamas rockets and the ceasefire and turning it into sort of a bilateral thing between a militant group that controls a territory, Gaza, and a state, Israel, and turning the whole issue into this bilateral thing between a militia and a state. I'm not sure how this helps Palestinian rights. I'm really doubtful about this. And I think anyone who really has the best interests of the Palestinians in his heart, and I do. I've grown up with the Palestinians. I was lucky actually to grow up in a country that saw the birth of the Palestinian national movement, the birth of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the launch of President Yasser Arafat, and the largest Palestinian diaspora, actually, the second largest probably after Jordan, and I'm referring to Kuwait basically. So basically, anyone who has the best interests of the Palestinians at heart would actually also advise the Palestinians to look at the fact that they already have tremendous international support. There's no doubt about this. But at the same time, they have a distraction. And that distraction manifests itself in a militia group that has its own agenda. It might, at face value, say that it's really fighting for Palestinian rights. But I think that it's a whole different subject. Everybody knows it's a militant group, dubious, a lot of things. So I think it's time really to talk about that as well.
Coming to the region, if we zoom out a bit, we have to see things from the perspective also that Israel was recently approved for relocation to the US Central Command from European Command, because that is a major transition for the US military establishment. And this raises a lot of pertinent questions as to the fact that now the Central Command commander, General Kenneth Mackenzie, is going to be overlooking. But while this development was approved in January 2021 and the Israelis were looking forward to join Arab Gulf countries and Pakistan as part of Central Command, one particular news group, Al Arabiya, with which you have also been associated, it published a report recently and claimed that because of this ongoing conflict, some insiders were quoted by Al Arabiya that perhaps Washington will defer this transition and will not bring Israel into central command unless this situation simmers down. Do you actually believe that could be the case, or is this too minor of a thing to impact Washington's own national interests?
Right. Well, Ziki, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the latest thinking is, but I do recall that the Pentagon did defend Israel's right to defend itself, and the strong support is there. And they've just approved an arms deal, a weapons deal for Israel. So I don't see much change. But having said that, the Biden administration does have, and the Democratic Party does have, a very strong base that favors getting tough with Israel. And not to get into any conspiracy theories, really, but I think a lot of people in the Biden administration were not happy with the fact that Israel seems to be leading the choir that is against the U.S. rejoining the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. And Israel is an important part of the regional opposition. There are many countries that oppose a return to the nuclear deal without looking at Iran's malign activity in the region and the missile program, in addition to the nuclear program. Uh, uh, but, but the original JCPOA does not really cover those things. And Israel was lobbying to include those things, and there are many other countries in the region doing that as well. And I think that somehow this conflict, which again I would say was started by Hamas, somehow it distracts Israel's attention away from the Iran nuclear deal and makes Israel possibly, I'm not sure yet, we are not sure, none of us really is so far, because we're yet to see what happens next. But I think that this conflict distracts Israel and reduces Israel's ability to sort of possibly put up the same kind of robust opposition to Iran nuclear deal the way Israel was doing before these events. And let's not forget, when Israel was opposing Iran, a return to Iran nuclear deal without including the missile program and Iran's malign activity in the region and the militias and so forth, when Israel was doing that, it was relying on support from many allies in the region that agreed with Israel on this point when it comes to Iran. And this includes both the Arabs and includes both, and also Turkey. And I would maybe a couple of other countries as well that are not so open about it. But with this situation right now, and with the fissures that have emerged now between Israel and Turkey, and of course between Israel and the member states of the Arab League and the OIC, would this weaken Israel's ability to oppose the U.S. return to JCPOA without including the missile program and Iran's malign activity? It's a very interesting point. I think we need to watch that. So I would strongly say that Hamas's military engagement of Israel somehow reduces Israel's ability to put forth the kind of robust opposition to a return to JCPOA minus Iran's malign activity in the missile program, and also creates problems for Israel's other potential allies in the region. I understand that Turkey would have supported Israel when it came to this point on Iran, and also several Arab countries, and maybe a couple of other countries in the region that may not be very open about this at this point. But this whole thing really messes the whole picture, and I would suggest, I would say we need to watch this. We're not sure of this. I'm not sure of this yet.
Speaking of potential allies in the region, after the signing of Abraham Accords and normalization of ties with some certain Arab countries, do you believe it is justified for for the Muslim world, especially Muslim majority countries, to place the onus of responsibility on those particular Arab countries to find a solution to this conundrum? Or do you think that it's not that camp alone that has to bear this responsibility?
From my watching the Palestinian conflict, Zeki, for a long time, those countries have always been involved in the Palestinian conundrum, the Palestinian-Israeli conundrum. So for me, I don't see them having disconnected in any way. The Abraham Accords, I don't see them as having sort of cut off those countries, the Arab countries, from whatever happens in the Palestinian territories and in the conflict itself. For example, let's take for example the United Arab Emirates continues to be I think one of the top 5 countries in the world, or top 6, that continue to support and help Palestinians financially and politically and diplomatically, like they've done over half century. Nothing has changed. Egypt was the first Arab country to sign a peace treaty with Israel, and they're strongly involved in the Palestinian conflict. So if everybody is involved in the Palestinian conflict, I think the presumption that somehow, because of the recent peace accords between some Arab countries and Israel, those Arab countries somehow cut themselves off and are out of the conflict. I think it's a wrong reading of the Abraham Accords. On the contrary,
But if
I
I
would say,
may,
on the
but if I
contrary,
may
for
politely,
example,
but if I may politely interject, if I may politely interject and ask you, you mentioned the UAE. Now the UAE is not just signed the accord, but it has actually incurred some investments, significant investments into Israel, such as shipping and other sectors. So, do you think that it could have exercise some sort of leverage into bringing out a favorable response or a compromise from Israel into sitting across the table with Hamas, for example?
oh, definitely, it creates a leverage. There's no question about it. But let me just correct you on one thing. Majority of the states, Arab and Muslim states in the region, do not support Hamas. So the assumption that somehow Arab and Muslim countries would intervene to save Hamas, that's not going to happen. Yes, they will intervene to save Palestinians, and they will intervene to help Palestinians, but they will not intervene to save Hamas. I remind you that almost all of the statements issued on this Gaza situation by all the major Arab and Muslim countries did not expressly mention any support for Hamas. They supported
Absolutely.
Palestinians, Palestinian rights, and they supported a stop of the death toll that the Palestinians are incurring. None of these statements supported Hamas. You have to be very clear. For you to say, or for anyone actually, for me to come here to say that somehow those Arab countries that signed recently went into diplomatic ties with Israel would somehow exercise leverage to sort of bring peace between Hamas and Israel, I don't think so. Hamas is considered a militant group. It does not get to decide when the whole Muslim world goes into war. That decision is not up to a militant group. That decision belongs to the Arab League. That decision belongs to the OIC. That decision belongs to Turkey, to Saudi Arabia, to Pakistan, to Egypt, to Jordan. I don't think any of these states have ceded their sovereignty or their decision-making process to a militant group with, again, as I would say, with a dubious agenda to decide when the whole region goes into war. That is not going to happen.
Speaking about Hamas and the support it, whether or not the support it enjoys in the Muslim world, I've been witnessing some trends and online campaigns going on over the past few days in Pakistani cyberspace and across the Indian subcontinent. There are some elements that are sympathetic to Iran that are trying to project Hamas as the sole defender and liberator of Palestine, and they're also, in fact, constantly trying to diss Arab states and the OIC for their purported failures in trying to resolve the issue. And they're also actually, their main focus is also on the Abraham Accords. So what do you think about that? Because when we talk about the Arab media, the Arab narrative, the Arab sentiments, you are more experienced in that. You are familiar with the language. You're connected to their analysts. What is the perception in the Arab world? What do they think of Hamas, and how much of a narrative difference is there between people in the subcontinent and those in the immediate periphery of Israel?
So this is a very interesting question, Zaki, that you ask about Hamas presenting itself as the sole defender of Palestine and Jerusalem of Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, there's one thing that a lot of the people who are following this conflict in Gaza are overlooking, which is the internal Palestinian political dynamic. When the events unfolded of the last Friday of Ramadan inside Masjid al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, one of the first things that came to my mind, quite honestly, Ziki, I'll be very honest, one of the first things that came to my mind was really not the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or dynamic. One of the first things that came to my mind was actually the conflict between the simmering conflict between Palestinians who support Hamas and Palestinians who support the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian government, President Mahmoud Abbas, Ramallah, the Palestinian Authority. So what I saw, in addition to the usual tension between Palestinians and Israelis, I also saw Hamas trying on that day, May 7th, Friday, last Friday of Ramadan, I also saw Hamas trying to enter the turf of Fatah movement, the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, and present itself as as you said, the defender of Palestinians. A lot of people forget that this is the year of the Palestinian elections. The elections were supposed to take place this year. They've been postponed for the time being. They could happen by the end of this year, next year, but they're going to happen. So what I saw when I saw May 7 happening that night, late at night, yes, there were a lot of tensions between Israel and Palestinians, the evictions, the ultra-nationalist Jews marching in Jerusalem and so forth. But there was also the element of Hamas entering Fatah and Palestinian government's turf. So this is also a turf battle. And when I say that Hamas tried to hijack everything that's happening in Jerusalem and take it all the way to Gaza and shift the whole narrative, one of the things that benefits Hamas is actually positioning itself as the next winner of Palestinian elections. So this is a very important dynamic that I'm sure most people in Pakistan are not aware of, but it's also missed really internationally, but not in the Arab region. See, in the Arab region, nobody has lived with the Palestinian conflict more than the Arabs. They've been with this conflict. Nobody hosted the Palestinians more than the Arabs did. And I will not say that the Arabs spent the most on the Palestinians, because that honor, frankly, goes to number one, the United States, which has been for 50 years the biggest spender on Palestinian healthcare, Palestinian
Indeed.
education, Palestinian rehabilitation, everything, the whole services. So the United States of America, which by the way is demonized everywhere, especially in the Western media, not just in the Arab media, not just in Pakistan, but also in the Western media, is demonized as really this anti-Palestinian country that is supporting suppression of Palestinians. America is the biggest spender in history on Palestinian rights, on healthcare, and everything. So the honor of spending on Palestinian goes to the US, number one. Number two goes to the European Union. The Europeans have been the second largest spender on the Palestinians for half a century. The third from the Muslim world, let's be very clear on this, Zeki. From the Muslim world, among the top 20 biggest spenders and supporters of Palestinians, the top 20, only 3 Muslim countries are in the list. And this is not my list, this is the UN list. It's a very open list, it's available at the UN website. The only 3 countries that have been in the list of the top 28 givers to the Palestinians have been number one, Saudi Arabia, number two, the United Arab Emirates, and number three, Kuwait. So these 3 countries, but this does not take away the contribution of Jordan, the contribution of Egypt, and the contribution of Morocco, which chairs the Jerusalem Committee in the OIC. All the maintenance work you see that happened in Masjid al-Aqsa over the last 60, 50, 60 years, the Muslim and the Christian Palestinian holy sites, the maintenance, looking after the people, the families that look after those sites, have been happening through these channels. So the Arabs have been involved in this conflict, and how the Arabs see this conflict, there's a huge shift. You have to understand this. Arabs support Palestinian rights. There's no question about it. But there's a lot of debate on whether Hamas really is the representative or the defender of Palestinian rights. Yes, as you know, radical politics always have a ready audience in our region for many, many reasons, including in Pakistan, obviously. So when you have a militant group like Hamas, it will have lots of people supporting it. But in the Arab media, in the Arab among the Arab intellectuals, the influencers, the analysts, the decision makers, people in government, I don't think that Hamas has that kind of support that you see maybe in the public, and lots of the heroics things that Hamas is doing that are considered to be heroics are seen as by many actually as hurting the Palestinian cause and pushing the Palestinian cause backwards. Palestine and the Palestinians have the most support of any cause that I know of anywhere in the world. I've worked very closely with Kashmiri activists, and I wish the Kashmiris could have 5% of the kind of support that the Palestinians get worldwide. And I don't think that Hamas really adds anything to that. Hamas does not add anything to that support. Hamas has no role, frankly, in this huge support that the Palestinians get. And I think that the Palestinians were about to really achieve a major political win with regards to evictions, with regards to ultra-nationalist Jewish extremists, for example, marching in Jerusalem. Lots of good things were about to happen for the Palestinians when Hamas really jumped right in the middle and shifted the narrative. So this is the Arab media. Now, when you come Iran is a very important point. Before I move to Pakistan, I just would like to mention very quickly Iran. Iran's role. See, Iran is not the
Yes.
first. It's not the first country that would be cashing in and capitalizing and exploiting Palestinian misery. The list of people who exploited Palestinian misery and made money and name on Palestinian blood is a long list. We have 70-year history, so we can list lots of people. But Iran, especially after 1979, with the seizure of power by the Ayatollahs, by the what I call the Khomeinyists. The Khomeinyists, when they took power, basically they turned exploiting Palestine into an art form. Just take one example and I'll move forward, which is the Al-Quds Force. It's named after Jerusalem. It's named after Masjid al-Aqsa, Al-Quds Force. But the entire focus
Absolutely.
of
The IRGC.
the IRGC, Al-Quds Force, of course, is the external arm of the IRGC.
Yes.
And Al-Quds Force, named after Jerusalem, named after Palestine, is focused really on Yemen, is focused on Iraq, is focused on Syria, Lebanon, and Afghanistan. The drones that the IRGC and Quds Force develop, they are made to target Jeddah, Saudi cities, Riyadh, Mecca, but they're quiet when it comes to Israel. And I was really amused to watch the Iranian foreign minister, whom I really admire. I think he's an amazing diplomat. He's a great scholar. He's a great guy, amazing person, but he's in the wrong place, unfortunately. And Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif in the OIC Special Summit on the situation in Palestine, I was really amused when he made a statement that basically said, we are willing as Iran to work with all members of OIC on all political and legal measures to help the Palestinians. And I was really amused, and I thought maybe if I had a seat on that table, I would have loved to ask Foreign Minister Zarif, what about Al-Quds Force? See the Saudis, the Turks, the Pakistanis, nobody actually claimed that they've made an army specifically to liberate Palestine. They can't. But the Iranian government did, and it celebrates Al-Quds Day annually, and all of its militias across the region march on that day, and it has Al-Quds Force. So where are they now? Why have they helped Hamas throw all these rockets on Israel and have all these Gaza residents get killed, and while they sit quiet, and all their militias in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen are quiet? So that's the Iranian role. Not the only country that exploited Palestinian blood, but definitely one player that elevated exploiting Palestinian cause to an art form. And I conclude now by Pakistan, the third point of your question. See, let's be very frank, Zaki, here. I mean, we both are from Pakistan, so let's be very frank. I love my country. You love our country. We love our country. But Pakistan has no role in the Palestinian conflict. We in Pakistan and the Palestinians never had any role in the Palestinian conflict over the past 70 or 80 years. None whatsoever, beyond probably just taking diplomatic positions at international forums, which we did, which is the right thing to do. I'm not underestimating or undermining that. But the fact is, other than that, we've never been a player. We cannot do anything. I mean, even now, look at the irony of the Pakistani government organizing state-sponsored protest on May 21 to protest, on the streets in a country that has a very bad experience with street protests, by the way. And we have the experience of what happened with anti-Europe and anti-France protests recently. And that's what a country the size of, and I think it's ridiculous for a country the size of Pakistan, with the kind of influence that Pakistan should have, that we are making do with a state-sponsored protest. Whereas the real player and actors are countries like, for example, Egypt, which is engaging both Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, and the Israeli government. And even the United States and Europe is depending on Egyptian mediation. I would assume maybe the Turkish government might also be doing something in the background because it has a good relationship with all the three key players, Israel, Hamas, and the Palestinian government. You will notice anyone who can really contribute something to helping Palestinians has relations with the key parties involved. A country like Pakistan that does not have any relationship, frankly, with the parties on the ground, with the exception of the Palestinian Authority, and our relationship with them stops at the diplomatic level. That's it. We don't, and maybe to a certain extent we help them train some of their diplomats in our academies in Pakistan, and we train some of their police force and some of their soldiers, and that's it. Very limited, by the way. Good, but very limited. So Pakistan does not have. I think again, many Pakistani politicians. I think it takes leadership to tell the truth to the people, and I think a politician who's out there to get vote is not going to do that. We can discuss that. A politician won't do that. So our politicians are basically playing to the gallery, nothing more. But the fact of the matter is, Pakistan has no role. And let's be very blunt, and let me be very open. Unless Pakistan has direct diplomatic relations with Israel, and Pakistan has direct, very activist role and presence with the Palestinian Authority, and we are present, we should be present in either Ramallah or in Tel Aviv, like the Turks are, like the Emiratis are, like the Sudanese are, like the Egyptians are. Unless we do that, we have no role. We have absolutely no role whatsoever. I was really amused, and I was feeling sorry that one of the good philanthropists and charity workers in Pakistan, Faisal Eidi, of the Eidi Foundation.
In the Eidi Foundation.
Exactly. When he decided to maybe go and see the situation on the ground in Gaza and maybe, contribute and help, he couldn't do that. He didn't even know where to go, whether to apply for a visa with the Egyptians, with the Jordanians, with who exactly. And that's only because Pakistani diplomacy and the Pakistani state does not have a presence. It does not have a presence in Ramallah. It does not have presence in Tel Aviv. We cannot help if we don't have a presence. So we have no role. And frankly speaking, beyond statements and maybe occasionally helping the Palestinian government when they needed our vote inside the OIC and at international forums, mainly, of course, the United Nations, and when we were members of the rotating members of the non-permanent members of the UN Security Council. Beyond that, Pakistan is not a player. None, not at all. And let me add to you and to the knowledge of many Pakistanis that there were times when some of our governments, Pakistani governments, did want to play an activist role, and it was our Palestinian friends who suggested for us to stay away because we are not a key player, and that they are very comfortable having the United States, the European Union, Egypt, and the major Arab countries actually play a direct role with Pakistan, and politely asking Pakistan basically to limit its support diplomatic support, basically. So we don't have a role really. So I'm really very amused to see how the Pakistani public opinion is worked up. And it's mainly because of religious reasons, as you rightly pointed out. It's mainly for religious reasons. And I think it's dangerous for the Pakistani government to raise the expectations of the Pakistani public. And I see, for example, right now, the government of Prime Minister Imran Khan, it's very good what he's doing. We need to register our support for the Palestinians, our concern for what's happening, because it affects regional peace, global peace, and of course the rights of the Palestinians. That's all very, very well. But to raise the expectations of the Pakistani public opinion and designate a day on May 21, which is a Friday, by the way, and designate a day for protests, state-sponsored, no less, in a country that just came out of very, very disastrous anti-France protests that again were partially, in a way, were also government sponsored and went really bad. I think we need not to raise the expectation. We need to introduce an element of rationality, of an element of reason. And while I'm saying this, Zaki, let me also just say this: Arab League, not so much the Arab League, but more the OIC and governments like the Pakistani government, they make themselves irrelevant to what's happening in Palestine. They make themselves irrelevant when their statements are really made to play to the gallery and not actually to solve the situation on the ground. So while it's right to be very, very concerned at the high casualty rate of the Palestinians, the Hamas rockets on civilian populations in Israel is also an issue. No country in the world can allow a non-state actor to execute this kind of warfare against the state. Pakistan certainly did not allow the TTP, which is the Pakistani Taliban, to do it. Pakistan did not allow the militant wing of a political party in the city of Karachi, the largest city of Pakistan, to do it. Saudi Arabia did not allow, and the Yemeni government did not allow a militia in Yemen, which is the Houthis, to do it. There is no way that the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government would be happy and for Hamas, for a militant group, to also be raining rockets on population centers. So while it's right to condemn the high death casualty rates because of the Israeli strikes in Gaza, it's also, I think governments like Pakistan and the OIC make themselves irrelevant to the cause and make themselves and put themselves on the sidelines when they take a partisan stance that does not really address the situation on the ground.
Which brings me to the last question, and I have reframed it a bit now in view of your response. So, am I correct in inferring that, according to your perspective, that Pakistan cannot be an influencer or a stakeholder in this? The recent, I find it unprecedented that Pakistan's Foreign Minister, Mr. Shah Mahmood Qureshi, has gone on an ambitious program along with his Turkish counterpart, Mr. Maulud Çavuşoğlu. And I've just recently seen some tweets in which the Tunisian FM has also joined them. They're going with the Palestinian ambassador to the UN. So that overdrive which you see, um, permit me to ask this: is that all for the just to satiate the domestic audience and just for the optics? Because as you point out in your perspective, that's not Pakistan's role. At least is not going to yield anything. Turkey recognizes Israel. Tunisia has some sort of communication going on. Pakistan does not have any channel going on. So what is all this? If I may ask you in conclusion, is all of this just optics?
All the, as you said, all the countries you mentioned that are going on this Palestine mission to New York have some sort of relations with Israel. All of them, and you mentioned Tunisia. On the last 10 days of Ramadan, which are for Muslims are of really extreme importance for Muslims. Very, very important religious days for all of us, for Muslims. The last 10 days. The Prime Minister of Tunisia joined a very important Jewish religious festival that took place in a very historical synagogue in Tunisia that saw Tunisian Jews and Jews from the outside also travel and join that event, with the Tunisian Muslim Prime Minister joining that event on the last day, in the last 10 days of Ramadan. So as you said, all of these countries actually have some sort of relationship with Israel. Tunisia does not have a diplomatic relationship, but has a very, very strong other channels with Israel, and has
Indeed.
a very, very, very robust Jewish Tunisian community. And of course, Turkey and even Sudan. The Sudanese foreign minister who joined the Pakistani foreign minister in this trip to New York was coincidentally returning from Paris, where President Macron was lobbying for the international community to waive the debts, about $50 billion of his country, Sudan. And of course, France, the Sudanese foreign minister was coming from France, a country which the Pakistani foreign minister's boss, our prime minister, wants to rally the Muslim countries to boycott. So you know, the whole scene is full of so many contradictions. I don't know where to begin. So in the case of Pakistan, it's quite obvious that our government is playing to the gallery. There's no doubt about this. There's nothing that the Pakistani government can do in this situation. None that I can see in my limited knowledge. If there's something that's been readied or cooked in behind the scenes, let's see. Maybe I'll be proven wrong, and we all will be surprised. But I'm fairly certain of all the countries that you mentioned that are gone to New York, and it's a good exercise. It's good to register your diplomatic position and to lobby. It's a good thing. But of all the countries you mentioned, the only country, the nuclear armed country with a very strong influence in the region, Pakistan is no small country. Pakistan is a very small, important country. It can play a role. But unfortunately, in this conflict, we have no role whatsoever. And this is what we need to tell our people. Pakistan does not have a role. And maybe it's a troubled government in Islamabad that is facing so many problems within its government and with the opposition that is trying to sort of, escape outside and trying to sort of present a strong face in front of the people, or I don't know what they're trying to do. I'm not sure. I know what the Turkish game plan is, and I know what the other countries are doing. I'm sitting in Islamabad, honestly, Zeki, and you're also sitting in Islamabad, and honestly, I have no idea what is the agenda of Prime Minister Imran Khan's government. What is he exactly trying to achieve? Because we have no cards in our hand. We don't even have. I would dare to say that 99.8% of Pakistanis never met a Palestinian in their lives. They never met a Palestinian. We do not have any cultural exchange with Palestinians. I do. You probably do. A few Pakistanis do who lived outside, who went outside, or maybe interacted with Palestinians. A majority of Pakistanis, including a lot of people, by the way, in the government and in places of important positions of decision-making in Palestine, have not met or seen the situation on the ground in the West Bank and Jerusalem. I would dare to say, when it comes to even on Israel, maybe the positions of Pakistanis are far more extreme than the positions of Palestinians. At least the Palestinians have recognized Israel. And despite everything that you see happening right now between the Palestinians and Israel, the conflict, the Gaza, the casualties, everything, they have direct communications, including Hamas. They have direct communications with Israel. All the roads, I'm sure everybody is watching and seeing all these high rises in Gaza and the West Bank and the nice infrastructure, the streets and everything. The money that is spent, all of that, in addition to the international aid, it's also spent from revenue that every month Israeli government transfers to the Palestinian government, which in turn spends it on the services provided to the Palestinian people. So there's so much interaction and interdependencies between Palestinians and Israelis. Pakistanis don't know that there are a large number of Palestinians are Israeli citizens, and they're
If
members
I may
of.
add, because there are a lot of people online also, there are a lot of divisive elements. Some people from the left wing, some people who are from the conservative, some in the center, and some of the more open-minded people who have knowledge of history. They have actually been opining and trying to emphasize rather that the Palestinian cause, it's a nationalist struggle. It does not have anything to do with religion. Whereas in our part of the world, we turn it into something of a religious issue.
Oh
The
yes,
Palest- for the
yes.
Palestinians, obviously, it's an issue of territory and sovereignty, as compared more to religious doctrine.
That's why some of our diplomats, Pakistani diplomats, they might be retired now. They were shocked when, at one point, I'm not sure exactly the date of when this happened, but usually Pakistan's permanent representatives to the United Nations are the ones who read the statements on behalf of the OIC on the Palestinian conflict. So, at one such instance, uh, a draft was being approved to be read out by the Pakistani permanent representative, and the Palestinian ambassador objected. You know why? The Palestinian representative objected because the Pakistani draft spoke in terms of this cause being religious, and that we need to stand by Muslim Palestinians and defend Muslim religious sites in Palestine. And the Palestinian representative objected, and he said, we cannot approve this statement if you do not add, if you remove that this is, the insinuation that this is about Muslim Palestinians, because this cause, the Palestinian national movement, includes equally Palestinian Christians, and the Palestinian national struggle is for Muslim and Christian holy sites. And even now, the Jordanian sponsorship of holy sites in Palestine, including Masjid al Aqsa, specifically includes Muslim and Christian sites. And if you were to watch the state channel of Palestine, the satellite broadcast, you'd see that they very, very clearly sort of stay away from turning this into a religious conflict, and they make it a national liberation, nationalist conflict, and nationalist movement. Unfortunately, it's really very sad, and I again hold Pakistani government officials responsible for this, for raising expectations, for twisting it, for playing to the gallery or maybe to get votes. That it's very unfortunate, for example, to see the incident that happened a couple of days ago in London, where I would assume, I'm not sure, I claim that people of South Asian background came out on London streets and called for the rape of Israeli women. And in their minds, this was the right way to defend Palestinian cause in their
That's
mind.
very unfortunate.
And I'm very happy to see members of the British Parliament of South Asian origin, specifically of Pakistani origin, condemn this very, very clearly and call it anti-Semitism. Uh, so it's in this instance gives you a clear example that unfortunately the vast majority in countries like Pakistan, unfortunately, because of the way it's politicized and presented, uh, uh, consider this a religious conflict, and instead of defending the rights of Palestinians, they venture to criticize and attack the Jewish faith, the Jewish religion, and the Jewish people, which are two different things. I mean, and we can of course discuss this. That would be a long discussion. But to cut it short, I think in a country like Pakistan, it's very, very dangerous for us to take the religious route and radicalize a population that is already very, very disturbed for the right reasons. It's right. We are disturbed for what's happening to the Palestinians. We stand by them. We support them for religious reasons, for moral reasons. That's the right position to take, but it's being done the wrong way. And again, as long as the Pakistani politicians and decision makers and governments do not decide to play a real role to help the Palestinians, like other countries are doing, like Egypt, like Turkey, like the United Arab Emirates, like Sudan, like Tunisia, like others. Unless we do that, I'm afraid this would be an exercise in futility, and it would draw ridicule from friends and from people afar.
Well, that was a very interesting wrap up from you. You've summarized all of it in a very interesting manner. And I must add that again, I think the crux of what you've said it when it comes to Pakistan's efforts and its ambitious initiative to take Turkey and other countries along. The fact of the matter that all these countries which could play some sort of an influence do have some sort of a channel with Israel, because if you don't recognize the other party, how are you going to exercise any sort of mediation in between? So I
Let me,
think
let, Zaki,
that is very important.
Zaki, let me just add this. This is
Yes,
exactly
please.
like I just want to draw a parallel. This is
Yes,
exactly like trying to resolve Kashmir conflict without recognizing or having diplomatic relations with India.
absolutely. Well,
It's
on
the
that
same thing.
note, absolutely. I think that is the takeaway for this program. And on that note, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Ahmed Quraishi, for your time and your patience during the recording of this program. And I look forward to having you in the future as well. Thank you very much.
I look forward, Zaki, and thank you very much. It's a really very nice, insightful discussion, and keep up your great work.
Thank you so much.